Thank you so much. So this is my first speaking engagement, so you're just going to have to bear with me for a minute while I get set up. So good morning. I was married to the love of my life, David. He was the man God put on this earth just for me. The man that tucked me in every night, kissed me on the forehead, on the lips. The man that teared up when I was in pain, and the man that celebrated every single one of the happy moments for me. He was by far my biggest fan. And then on August 9th, 2020, by 6 p.m., I was a widow. And by 8 p.m. that same night, I was sitting in my home, alone by choice, thinking, I don't know what just happened. It's going to be a bad dream. I'm going to wake up from it. But 4 years later, it wasn't a dream. Now, in 2017 was when David was first diagnosed with his cancer. I had just retired from my current job. I was pursuing a career in teaching, another amazing story of faith. And David had developed a spot on his leg and went and had it biopsied. It wouldn't go away. And the dermatologist looked at it and said, 99% sure this is basal cell carcinoma. No big deal. You're going to be fine. Turns out he was 100% wrong. It was melanoma. So the next few weeks were a blur. We had the melanoma spot removed. They were able to get it all this first time. Then we take a trip to the hospital where they remove one of his lymph nodes to see if it had spread. And at this time, the cancer had not spread. So then we were able to spend the next 3 years just enjoying life. We were spoiling our grandchildren. We were traveling. We were arguing over where we were going to eat. We were going to concerts. We were going to live theaters, family vacations, arguing over where we were going to eat on our family vacations, et cetera, et cetera. Life was great. Even if we never, ever agreed on where we were going to eat, life was still good. So 2020 was an interesting year for all of us. COVID was happening. David was grounded from traveling. He did that a lot with his job. And then I was working from home because I was teaching. And we came up with this bright idea, it'd be a great time to get serious about the remodel on our little fixer-upper home. And in the midst of hanging the green rock in the new bathroom we were adding, David started to complain about his neck hurting. Now, he had some degenerative disc there, and he was overdue for his injections on it. So the next day, made an appointment with his neck doctor, and then subsequently they get canceled because it wasn't considered a necessary procedure under the COVID guidelines. So we did the best he could. He started getting worse headaches. His neck started to hurt. And it's that time I noticed he really just wasn't himself anymore. Now, the only appointments not being canceled at this time were oncology appointments. And he had one at the end of June, very routine at that point. He was going every 6 months. And at that point, he told the doctor that in the last few months, he had developed a pain in his neck. And if you're married and you were with your spouse during COVID, he was not talking about me being the pain in his neck, okay? He was telling his oncologist about the legit pain in his neck at that time. So the doctor told him, he goes, hey, let's do a brain MRI. We haven't done one in a while. You're due for it. Let's just rule that out, and then we'll go from there, and maybe I can help get your procedure for your neck bumped up for you. So he made that appointment for Monday, July the 6th of 2020. Now, I will say that July the 6th, the whole week, was one of the best and worst weeks of our entire life. But as you're soon going to learn, God was setting the stage for what was to come from there. Now, I love teaching, but I was just at a campus at that point that wasn't a good fit for me anymore. So I started applying for jobs all over the place, a little closer to home, and one came up at the Dream Campus where I wanted to work, and it was in the same district I was in. So I applied for it. Hey, you. So I applied for it, and I got an interview on the morning of July 6, 2020. Now, of course, it was a Zoom interview due to the in-person limitations. So I got all dressed up in my best interview clothes from the waist up, and I had that interview. And since I couldn't go with David to his MRI, I would have had to sit in the car in the heat. I decided to stay home and wait for the phone call. They promised to let me know by that afternoon. And sure enough, I get a call from my new principal to tell me I got the job. At the very same time, David is having the MRI done on his brain. So I'm excited. I'm thinking, this is a great sign. I have good news. He's going to have good news. And we're just going to get on with our lives from here and get his neck fixed. So he came home. I told him I got the job. And he's like, great, we'll go find somewhere to go that's open. I have an appointment in the morning with the brain doctor to get the results, and then we'll just go celebrate. But instead, we sat in that brain doctor's office as he quietly explained that David had 4 suspicious spots in his head, in his brain, and 2 of them were really significant. There was one here on his temple and one on the back of his head or his neck. That's what was causing all the pain. And we did not go celebrate. And honestly, I don't even remember the rest of the day after that. So now we're to Wednesday of that week, July the 8th, second birthday of our twin grandsons, who just happened to have been born on my parents' anniversary. And so we FaceTimed them that day. Their birthday party was going to be that weekend. And life was becoming a blur. I don't remember anything else about that day either, just seeing those grandbabies. So then on Thursday, David had to do pre-op for his upcoming surgery Friday. So we loaded up our beautiful granddaughter, Kennedy, who's with me here today. She is the absolute light of his life, the thing that kept him going. And we decided we were going to go do pre-op and then go furniture. Well, I'm going to say shopping for you all, but we actually went furniture procrastinating because I would pick it out, and then David would go look at it, and then he would go research it, and then we'd go back and sit on it, and then we would go back and sit on it again, right? So that's what we went. We were going to go furniture procrastinating that day to give us something to do. So we're on our way to the hospital, and David's daughter, Sydney, called his phone. And at this time, she was pregnant with her first child, baby boy, Walker, going to be our 4th grandchild. And she was getting the results that day of some testing she had done. And so David decided, he said, I'm just going to call her later. I'm not going to answer right now. I'll just call her when I've got a little bit of time to talk. But she immediately called my phone after that. And so I put her on speakerphone so that her dad could hear. And it was at that point that we could tell by her voice and the sound of her tears that something was terribly wrong. She proceeded to tell us that she just found out that her baby had a fatal form of skeletal dysplasia, and he would either not survive birth or he would die shortly after. And again, I don't remember much else about that day. The only thing I remember was being at the furniture store and sitting on that couch that we were procrastinating about, trying to make sense of it all. I'm on one end, David on the other, Kennedy in between us, just trying to figure out what is going on in our lives. And then on Friday, July the 10th, David's having the spot on his temple biopsied while his son and his wife were getting married in the Garden of the Gods in Colorado. They wanted a private ceremony, and that was the very blessed event that happened to us that week, the bright spot in our life. So this was a week that changed the course of everything that we knew, for better and for worse. Now, I remember that Friday morning sitting in the waiting room, maybe 5 other people there because they wouldn't allow you to bring a lot of people at that time. And I remember the surgeon coming out to tell me that David made it through the surgery. The surgery was a success, but they confirmed what he had already suspected, that the spots were David's melanoma. I remembered he walked away, and I just put my head in my lap and quietly cried so I didn't disturb anyone else's pain. And I managed to pull myself together and so that I could appear normal for David, because that's how much I loved him. And I remember walking into the room that they had him in the ICU, and he's just laughing and talking with the nurse that was in there. And so I assumed he didn't know anything and joined in. And he's sharing our love story and telling her how good I take care of him. And then after she left, he looked at me and in all seriousness asked me, did the doctor come talk to you? And I didn't lie. I said, yeah, I know. And it was at that point I realized he also knew, and that he was putting on a brave face for me. And then that's just the kind of love that we shared, putting each other first. So we spent the next month, doctor's appointment, making the best of our isolation. We had Kennedy with us most days, and she kept him entertained and smiling. David was still able to work. He loved his job, so that was a big plus for him, and that kept him going as well. Now, he had started what they call immunotherapy treatment, and they told us it's really not going to be successful if he's taking steroids for the brain swelling. So we knew at that point he was going to have to come off of them, and we started to lower his dosage. And he was convinced. He's like, we're going to beat this again. Everything is going to be fine, babe. Give me a year, and things are just going to be right back to normal. Well, he took his last steroid on a Friday, and then Saturday was his dosage skip day, so he was pretty tired that day. I always went to bed before him, so when he came in to kiss me goodnight, he just sat on the edge of the bed instead. He was very quiet, and so I just kept thinking, he's going to say something. It's almost like he wanted to, but he couldn't, or he just wanted to sit there. I don't know. But finally, he just kissed me goodnight and he left. Now, for the longest time after he passed away, I beat myself up about that moment. I had so much guilt. I just let Satan kind of take over, fill me with guilt, remorse, and I focused on that day and what I didn't have. But just through, therapy, grief share, great people, I realize now that is also a part of this story. And so I no longer beat myself up about that at all. So the next morning, Sunday, August the 9th, I went to check on him, and it's then I knew something was wrong. I called the ambulance. They loaded him up, took him to the hospital. So I got dressed, and I went to the hospital, only to find out I was at the wrong part of it. If you're familiar with Harris downtown, or I think it's Texas Health now, it is always, always under construction. So I'm on my way back to the car to get to where I needed to be, and my phone rings. It's the emergency room doctor trying to figure out where I'm at. And so I told him what happened. He's like, yeah, you need to get over here ASAP. This is not good. So I finally find the ER, find my husband. They have him in a bed in a room, and he is sleeping, and he's snoring. And for a brief moment, I really thought that was a good sign, and I found out later that it's not. So I put my head on his shoulder, and I'd love at this point to tell you that I looked at my husband and I said, it's okay to go. I'll be okay. But I didn't. I begged him, please don't leave me. Please don't leave me. I can't do this. I can't do this without you. So if you've ever been in a situation like that, you realize life is not a Hallmark movie. It is real life, real death, and real emotions. So not long after that, I found myself alone in the waiting room again while they're doing an emergency vent to keep David alive. As this time, I have to call all 4 of our children to tell them that it does not look good. So we had decided early on we weren't going to tell them about the situation because of what's going on with Sydney. Harrison had just got married, and we were just going to wait till he was better, and then we would share it with them. So needless to say, they were all quite shocked when we had to call. I also had to call his parents, and that, I think, broke my heart more than any phone call I had to make. So finally, I got a nice doctor that was able to explain things for me to understand them. And that's when I knew David's not coming back from this. No matter how many steroids I thought he needed, no matter how much I loved him, this was going to be it. And I was going to say goodbye to the love of my life and feel my heart shatter into a million pieces. And I did. I had to say goodbye to the love of my life. So I went through the next few days planning a funeral, started my new job, and then preparing for the birth/death of my 4th grandbaby. And then that day arrived, November 3rd, 2020. To say the least, it was a very serene day. I was still numb, not having any real normal emotions, and I was just trying to mentally prepare, loss of husband, new job, birth of grandbaby, death of grandbaby, and then I'll figure out my life. So our grandson was born, and he did not die at birth. So we were all able to take turns holding him. I remember staying back because technically I was the step-grandma. And then finally, it was my time. And I held him so close, soaking in what I could and etching him to my memory. And as I'm handing him back to his mom, Sydney, I notice he is covered in hair, like all over his back and arms. And it's one of those moments that takes you out of where you're at, and you're just like, why am I even thinking about this? And it wasn't like normal baby-looking hair either, so it really caught my attention. And I remember thinking, he looks like Grand David. Now, that's what the grandkids called David, because when Kennedy was born, he was just too young to be a grandpa, so we started calling him Grand David because he wouldn't be called grandpa. So anyway, I said, he looks like Grand David here. And it was just such an odd little thing, because David was a hairy guy too. He's probably shaven when he was, 6 or 7 years old, maybe. I don't know. He had a great 5 o'clock shadow. I will tell you that. But I think that was God's way of comforting me, kind of reminding me that, hey, David's going to be there when Walker arrives in heaven. He's not going to be on his own. And in an odd way, it really, really did comfort me. Now, as I tell my story, I can see the tears, some sadness, and I even feel it. I'm still grieving. I'm still sad some days. And I think you're probably even wondering if I ever felt God's presence at all during this difficult time, because I really haven't mentioned God in my story. So do I believe he was there? Yeah, I do. I know God was there. Because not only was he there, he was already getting things ready for me to endure all those days ahead, years before David even died. All I needed was to be obedient and have faith. So now let me retell the story and show you how much God loves us. I'm going to take you back to 2016 when I retired from my job and I got called to be a teacher. And that's just a whole nother, it's a crazy story. But I'm like, okay, I'm going to have faith finally. I'm going to have faith and I'm going to do this. And I did. And I'm working on my teaching certification and all the pieces are falling into place. And then just a few months later, 2017, in the midst of me, same week that I'm testing, doing my state certification test, my husband tells me he has melanoma. And I'm like, really, Lord? That's not how this was supposed to work. I had faith you were going to make all this work out for me. But what I didn't know then is that God had laid the groundwork for me to have the most amazing support group that only he could assemble. Because on July 6th, I was interviewing for my dream job right before all my other dreams shattered. And I remember that the week that, I found out about Walker and I found out about David's cancer. So the following Monday, I went to my campus to tell my new principal and my new assistant principal what was going on in my life. Politely, I told them, I said, look, I don't know what the future holds. So if you need to hire someone else, no hard feelings on that. If it was me, I wouldn't hire me either. I've got a lot going on here. But I remember they looked at me and they said, I will never forget it. They said, we are family here, but your family is more important. You go take care of your family and do what you have to do. Your job will be here. And then when David died, the day before I was supposed to be on that new campus, they had everything done. They did my room. They did my meet the teacher stuff. They did everything for me. Everyone pitched in and helped. And then when I showed up a week and a half later, one day before the students were supposed to come back to school, they just loved on me. Perfect strangers. I had not met most of them, but perfect strangers for the most part. The assembly that God chose to carry me through the next difficult years. And I'm still there, and they're still there. And they're still cheering me on. They're still loving on me. And I'm so blessed because God showed up in that teaching moment when I didn't even pray yet. He showed up even before I was able to pray. So then back to August the 9th, 2020. So remember, I'm on my way to the ER. I went to the wrong place. The ER doctor called. That's when he told me it didn't look good. I needed to hurry. But I hung up the phone and I stopped at the back bumper of my car. And I just asked God for two things. It wasn't a formal prayer. It was more just like a request. And I said, Lord, if this is it, please don't make me make that difficult decision. I can't do it. And Lord, if this is it, please don't let him suffer unnecessarily. And a peace came over me. And at that point, I had faith that if this was it, because I was still convinced everything was going to be fine, that God had heard my request. And then remember the difficult phone calls I had to make to the kids, reminding you it's COVID. So when I called each one, I told them, you're welcome to come up here, but I don't think they're going to let you in. And then I sat there and I just told Lord, I said, I am so overwhelmed at the thought of them not seeing their dad to say goodbye. And I don't even know what to do with this part of it. So my daughter, Mandy, she's the one that got there first, and they did allow her to come be with me in the emergency room. And while they were moving David back to the ICU, where he was recovering from his brain biopsy the month before, we were waiting to hear what we could tell the other 3 children. And we walked in the room, and there she was. The same nurse in the same room that he had when he was there for his brain biopsy. And she remembered him, and she remembered our story. And she was really quite saddened that this had happened. And so I told her, I introduced Mandy, I told her our other 3 children are waiting outside, and it's August. And so she went to talk to the charge nurse to see if there was anything that they could do. And the charge nurse, in the midst of a pandemic, approved all 4 kids to come in and be with David and I. And they even gave us a private room so we could make that decision. That horrible decision I asked God not to make me make. But by this time, I'd seen all the evidence I needed to see that David was not going to make it. And when I shared this with the kids, they all grew quiet. And so I told them, if it's up to me, I love him enough to let him go, but that we would make this decision together. Now, David's son Harrison spoke up first, and he said, my dad would not want to live like this. And the other 3 all nodded in agreement, and there it was. God answered my fleeting request on my way to the ER. Because you see, I had to make that decision, but it wasn't difficult at this time because we made it together and we made it out of love. And as we gathered around his bed, holding his hands, holding each other, they removed the life support from his body. And he did not last long. He went fast. And again, I knew God heard and honored my request. And I don't take that lightly. So when I think back that day, I can relive every moment in my head. But the moment that always rises to the top for me is that God answered my request that day and that I had faith. And over the next few months, I could feel God's presence with me, but I just couldn't pray like I did before. I was heartbroken. But he knew my heart, and he never left me. Honestly, I never left him either. I knew he was there. But the prayers were really broken. Like I would just pray, Lord, will you just take me too? I'm not suicidal. I just want to be with David. Whatever that looks like, I just want to be with him. And then I closed my eyes, and every morning I would still be here. And this went on for a while because I'm thinking, he answered all my other prayers. What's one more? And every day I still woke up. So eventually I realized he wasn't going to answer that prayer. And I just told myself, you have some other purpose to fulfill first. Maybe then he will. So I let it go, started praying for David's daughter, Sydney, her husband, Odell, and precious little Walker. And my only prayer that I really remember was just asking God, could Walker live long enough for his parents to hold him, for them to feel his love, and then your will be done. Now, I know you remember the part of Walker's story where God had already answered these prayers because Walker's parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles all got to hold him. In fact, he lived through the night, and the next night, and the next night. He lived long enough that the hospital actually looked at Sydney Odell and said, you're going to have to take him home on hospice. Like, we don't know what to tell you. Here's his diagnosis. He's not supposed to be here. And so this is kind of out of our hands now. And they were panicked. We didn't even have a baby shower or anything. Though they had nothing, we were really scrambling at that point. So they took him home, and he just kept on living. Even with all of his health issues, he would quit breathing, and they didn't know why. It was hard for him to eat. So even with all of that, he just kept on living. So it was during that time Sydney was able to connect with a network of parents who also had children with forms of skeletal dysplasia, and every single one of them said, you need to get your child to Nemours Hospital in Delaware. They've got experts there, and they're going to be able to help. So she reached out. She sent all of the necessary paperwork, all of the things about his diagnosis. And sure enough, they reached out to her, and they told her, good news. Your baby was misdiagnosed. The gene factor for this fatal form of the skeletal dysplasia is the same gene for the type that he has. And though it's debilitating, it's not fatal. I will tell you, I did not hear the word misdiagnosed when they told me. I only heard the word miracle. It was a miracle, not a misdiagnosis. Now go back with me for a second when I first held Walker and I noticed he was covered in hair like David. And I thought this was a sign that David would be waiting for Walker so he wouldn't be scared. Well, after Walker was misdiagnosed, it hit me. They met. David and Walker met somewhere between heaven and earth. And the hair, funny enough, was a sign God knew that I needed to recognize that their souls had met. David knew his grandson. I believe he knew that he wasn't going to take his beautiful daughter's firstborn child. I know they met, and I still, to this day, cannot shake that feeling. It is that powerful. And I know that God was giving me a glimpse yet again into his plan. But all the faith in the world did not prepare me for this big of a blessing. And then as I look back on that night when he was sitting on the bed the night before he died, I believed then that God had given him a glimpse of what was to come. And I believe he knew Walker was going to live. Maybe he thought that sounded too crazy to tell me. Maybe he didn't want to give me false hope in case it was wrong. Maybe God told him he couldn't tell me. But I know that moment he knew. He met his grandson. And that is when I got my smile back. Now, I love to create stories, children's stories. So I've created one for each of the grandchildren, but I don't ever put them down on paper. They're usually just still floating around in my head. It's very busy up there, needless to say. But I came up with a fictional story about David and Walker meeting. And it was a story about a bear that wasn't like other bears, and a person that helps him find his forever home. So this idea floated around in there like the rest of them. And I thought, I need to write this down. But it was really just meant for Walker. And so I would start sharing this story with him. The first time was right before their big move to Delaware. And his mom, Sydney, was able to record it. And then each time I told it, I kind of changed it up just a little bit to make it sound a little bit better. So finally, Walker. The story of Walker, our precious little miracle, not our misdiagnosis, that wasn't going to live till birth. I have a current picture of Walker. If you could show that. There he is. He is going to be 4 years old next month, and he is the best little thing. Even with all of his surgeries and limitations, his smile and his happiness warm the heart of everyone that meet him. Now, his mom has a Facebook page called Walking with Walker. If you want to know more about her story, building up to the birth, and then his story and his continued story, feel free to check that out. But this is him, happy and healthy, and still our little miracle. So I'd like to say this is where my life gets boring, but we all know better. God never makes our life boring. I still struggle with grief and sadness, but I try harder now to honor God just like he honored my wishes. I try to show up, and I try to do what he has planned. And about 2 years ago, he spoke to me yet again. God revealed to me at that point that I was to share the story of how David and Walker met through a children's book about a bear that was flawed and the man that believed he could help this bear find his forever home. Does that sound familiar at all? He went on to tell me the bear would be named Wombly, and I was going to publish this story. Really? I kind of looked around to make sure he was talking to me and I was the only one in the room. So at that point, I became obedient-ish. Now, this is the part where every good speaker does some kind of an analogy. So you take something you're not even talking about, and then you take what you're talking about, and then you wrap it up into this nice story, and it's supposed to make sense at the end, and everybody goes, yeah, I know what they're talking about. Well, this isn't really that good, but it's all I got. It's my first speaking gig, so here it is. My obedience is like a bad Uber driver. So we're probably all familiar with Uber. You pull up the app, you put in where you're going, you pay. Someone on the other end goes, I think I'll go pick them up. They send you a picture, what their car looks like, their ETA. They show up, you get in, you confirm where you're going, and you go off on your way. No problem. Now that is what faith and obedience is supposed to look like. But have your Uber driver ever looked at you and said, no, I don't really think that's where you want to go. I really think you want to just take a drive through the hill country and go nowhere. Or, better yet, why don't we just drive around and see the scenery? No, that's not going to happen. But yet, that's what I do when God has a direction in my life. He's calling. I see it on the app, get excited, give him my ETA, pick him up. He gets in and he proceeds to tell me something like, I don't know. You know that story about David and Walker? You're going to write a book. You're going to publish it. You're going to share your story. Actually, you're going to share my story that I gave you. And then I look at it and I'm like, really? Because I was thinking maybe we were just going to continue to drive around and do nothing with my life. Or maybe we would just go to a parking lot somewhere and catch up. It's been a while. And he shakes his head no, and so I start driving, breathing heavy. What are we doing? What are we doing? Where are we going? This isn't where I'm supposed to be. I'm not really sure about this. And thankfully, there's a red light. And so I stop in my fake little red light, and I sit there trying to figure out how to tell God, I don't think I can do this. And then the Lord looks at me and says, the light turned green. And so I look at the Lord, and I'm like, but is it quite green enough to go on this path with you? And when he nods, I continue on. And then I'm on this path of God wanting me to write a book, and I see a Buc-ee's on my path. So I buy myself a little bit more time, tell him I've got to go into Buc-ee's, buy a few things for the road trip, peek out the window, and God is still there. So at that point, I realize he's serious, and we're going to go where I'm supposed to be going. So I wrote the story, rewrote the story, took a short course on how to write and rewrite a story, went on for about a year. And then finally, I just gave it to God. And at that point, when I went to rewrite it again, God took charge. And as I sat there with the pen in my hand, the words flowed from my head, through my heart, to my hands, and spilled out on the paper. And there it was, the story of Wombly. It's not up there anymore. I get a copy. The Perfectly Imperfect Bear. And on the day it was published, I just spent time in Jesus, praising him, sitting in awe, thanking him for helping me work through the pain to make something this beautiful, and allowing me to see what my faith could do, even in the midst of all that pain and all that heartache, because our God is just that great. And this still isn't the end of the story, almost. So God calls my Uber up again, and this time I'm thinking, yeah, I probably need to be a little bit more obedient. So I'm like, okay, on my way. And I was actually sitting in church a few weeks back, listening to a sermon series called It's Okay to Not Be Okay. Now, that was a good one. God does have a sense of humor. And so I'm listening to the speaker, and I get this overwhelming feeling that I, too, am supposed to be sharing my story. And I go to a pretty good-sized church. So I'm looking around, like, no, this feeling's going to pass. There are way too many people here. So I let it go, and I'm thinking, if that's God jumping in my Uber again, he's going to make this happen. 3 days later, Buster Clark texts me to see if I would come here to this church and share my testimony with you. And at least this time, I did not ask God to take a different route, and I did not hesitate near as long. I am slow, but I am obedient now. So let me leave you with this. This is my prayer for myself, and this is my prayer for anyone else that struggles with faith and obedience. And that is to be able to follow God's plan the first time He asks. And that the next time God summons me, I am ready. I'm going to go on probably 2 wheels. I'm going to go skidding in there because I'm going to be so excited. I'm going to pick him up. He's going to, or open the door for him. Maybe he's invited everyone, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, to go along on this ride. It's fine. I have an SUV, plenty of room for all of us. So everybody gets in, and I look at them. I'm like, where are we going? And they're going to get this look on their face like, where are we going? Like they know and I don't. But at that point, my Lord's going to look at me and He's going to say, we are going on the ride of your life. You just have to take your hands off the wheel and let me drive. And I hope and pray I have all the faith to look at Him, take my hands off the wheel, lift them high in the air like I'm on the best roller coaster I've ever been on in my life, and say, bring it on. I trust you. I trust you. Amen.